the human intelligence behind it.
I think he doesn't disagree, right?
And if it's faulty, it's not the computer, it's the people that program it and the bias that you put into it.
Hey, so you want to give us the official introduction?
Yes.
Good. I think I led into it.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Hank. All right, today's presentation will be on the subject of mental models and the limits of AI, or artificial intelligence, as Hank was just discussing. The discussion will be on how people frame or use mental models to make decisions. And with better framing, humanity can respond to our toughest societal challenges. Today's presenter is Kenneth Cukier, who happens to be our club member, Dina's nephew. Yay.
Yay. I don't know how many years ago I saw you, Ken. Do you remember?
It was just like yesterday.
Okay, that's the answer. It's all relative anyway. Yes.
You're good, Ken.
It feels
that's
like it. Yes.
That's the way it is.
Yeah. You got out of it. That was good. Okay, I have nothing else to say.
Okay. Ken is a New York Times bestselling author on technology and business, a senior editor at The Economist, and a host of its weekly tech podcast, Babbage. He's also a regular keynote speaker. He's an associate fellow at the University of Oxford's Sade Business School. Ken has also co-authored the New York Times bestseller, Big Data, a revolution that will transform how we work, live, and think, with Victor Meyer Schoenberger. His presentation tonight will be based on his new book, Framers, Human Advantage in an Age of Technology and Turmoil, we co-authored with Meyer Schoenberger and Francis de Vericourt. After the presentation, we will take care of random access and other business. So right now, take it away, Ken.
Actually, I just want to interject in there. Ken wanted me to show a book trailer, and then he's going to talk. And I'll show that in a moment. And I just wanted to say, we wanted to keep all questions to the end. So if you want to write in the chat, feel free to do that. That's not going to be bothering Kent, but don't speak, keep your mic closed until we open the floor for questions. And so I'm going to go ahead and show the video. And then when that's done, Ken, you can take the floor.
Great, thank you, Brandon.
Hold on, where's the video? There we go. Share.
Everything we do in life is a decision. But for the decisions that matter most, there's a better way by increasing your alternatives and improving your choices. It's called framing, harnessing the power of mental models of how the world works and how to shape your future. Training this cognitive muscle can transform your work, your personal life, and improve society. It's why humans are more powerful than machines, and how to build the future we want as framers.
Great. Thank you so much. It is such a great honor to be here to chat with all of you today. And it's a particular honor, of course, because Dina is here. So it's rare that one gets to talk about one's work with relatives there. And I see friends as well who are joined us today. So I'm really grateful that you've all come out. And I should also say that it was a great honor to be here at the New York Amateur Computer Club. As you probably know, you're one of the oldest clubs, amateur computer clubs in the world. West Coast, people always talk about the homebrew computer club, but of course it was a real ferment, 50 years ago or so in New York City about what was going on in terms of the potential of computing. Up in Boston, a lot of the machines were made, but of course all the customers and all the users were based in New York. And so what you've done to advance the state of the art, as Byte magazine reported dutifully in 1976, has been extraordinary. So thank you, it's an honor to be here. Framing, what is framing? When we frame an issue, when we take something and we look at it and we consider that we have one optic, but it could be something else. So we're sort of accustomed to what framing is when we think that we can actually imagine just one element of an issue when there's multiple things going on. And in fact, a lot of life is all about thinking of the world in which we have a perspective in which we imagine that we're seeing one thing, when in fact there might be more things going on, that if we change the frame that we're in, we can see it with a bit more reality, or we can emphasize certain elements and we can de-emphasize other ones for the purpose of what we're trying to do in a given moment. Now, these mental models or these frames are things that are intuitive to us because we do it all the time. In fact, we've been doing it since we're very young children. There's a lot of sociological and psychological research that shows the degree to which we are framing one issue in one way versus another. But a very simple way to understand it is the idea of the heliocentric versus the geocentric theory of the universe. And of course, what I'm showing here is a map of the heavens done by Ptolemy, who saw all of the celestial movements of the bodies in the sky at night as nested spheres. And we might laugh at it, but of course it works, right? If you put the Earth at the center of the solar system and you watch what's going on, you would be able to plot and know where Venus is going to be in 3 years or in 30 years with incredible accuracy, because these maps work very, very well. Now, as a model, it's not bad. It fits your needs for certain purposes if you wanted to understand and track the motions and identify where things are going to be at certain times in the future. But of course, it's not an accurate depiction of reality. This is, as a mental model, if you will, as a frame, it could be improved upon. Of course, and that is what Copernicus did. He simply changed the perspective, he changed the frame literally by saying, what if we don't put the Earth at the center and have these little epicycles, but in fact, in retrograde motions, but in fact, we put the sun at the center, it's just more simplified. And actually, if we were to actually run a real study, if we were to actually put a space probe out and then look at what's going on, this model fits more accurately the reality. Now, that's an important way of thinking about framing and mental models, because it sort of suggests that first, we can have multiple ones of them. They're legitimate, they can serve certain purposes, but that they might not be perfectly accurate to depict reality, but importantly, that we can change them. And by changing them, we can improve the decisions that we make. We can make them more accurate in terms of the mental model that we have. And by so doing, we can actually get better outcomes in the world because we've changed the way we see the world. So what is a mental model? A mental model or a frame is an abstraction. It simplifies the world and it makes the world comprehensible. Now, it's not a perfect representation of the world, of course, because it's going to emphasize certain elements and de-emphasize other ones. But it's still a rough and ready way of us to make decisions very quickly in time. These frames are ubiquitous. We're doing them all the time. We always have a mental model. Our mind, actually, the first thing that it does is creates a simulation of the world. And by doing so, at all moments, if we didn't have these representations or mental models, all of the experiences that we have would just be incoherent jumbles of simulations and observations and experiences, sort of like a baby looking left and right, or a very young child who hasn't been able to identify that this is a jackhammer and that this is a horn that's honking and that this is a violin concerto being played inside Carnegie Hall, when there's also a jackhammer and there's also a horn honking that is just in the din that we have. We do this, of course, the classical cocktail party in which we stride in, we listen to someone, there's noise everywhere, but our ear can pick up the conversation we're in. And if the conversation that we're in is particularly boring, we can tune out that conversation and eavesdrop on our neighbor. That ability, if you will, from an oral, ear, the sonic sense, can also be done in a mental sense. And so it makes the world's very practical usage of how we would interact with it. Now, let me give another example, or maybe more recent example of how framing comes into the fore. And it's a business example, because of course, by talking about in the sciences, it feels very rarefied, but it turns out we're doing these sorts of reframings all the time. So think of the example of Nokia and Apple and mobile phones. Now, about a decade ago, a little bit longer, 12 years ago, Nokia was the #1 handset maker in the world. They dominated. Almost 1 billion handsets were being used, and they were making the most money as well. And their mental model, if you will, was of the telecom world. So it was the telco model, and that suggested that they would actually try to have the cheapest handset as possible with the simplest parts, make it almost indestructible, and that they could ship the largest volumes by making it inexpensive. They were going to have these volumes, and all of the features would be determined by the telco centrally. Apple came in, but they didn't actually take that mental model, but they had a different mental model. And the frame they used was of the computing industry, which had different features. So for one thing, the great classical reliability of the telecom model was no longer there. In the computing model, we know this to the bane of our existence, because of course we had the 5 nines in the telephone world, which was 99.999% uptime, versus the computing world, which is typified by crashes and the blue screen of death. Be that as it may, the point is that Apple strode in and said, no, if we have it on the computing model, it doesn't have to be a cheap device. It can be a very expensive device. People pay $1,000 for it. People wait in line overnight to pay $1,000 for it. It'll also be able to be upgraded and the features would be added on through software, determined by the user, not determined by some sort of central operating authority. Now, you still had an app store that had standards to it, but the point is that users could determine the features for themselves, and it was easily upgradable. And it was in some ways a general purpose device. It would do many things, like a computer could do many things. It wouldn't do just one thing or the prescribed thing, like a telephone. And we saw what happened. The mental model of the telecom frame just was not appropriate, while the Apple's computing model was extremely well. But we can sympathize with Nokia. And the reason why is that they understood the world and the market very well, but what they didn't capture is that constraints that had existed in the past in terms of the cost of memory, consumer demand, had changed. That they needed to upgrade their counterfactuals of what was potential, asking the questions of what if they'd simply seen that they could loosen some constraints and tighten others. And by changing those constraints, Apple was able to dominate the market within just several years. And Nokia now, after teetering almost on the brink of bankruptcy, is basically a non-entity in the world of mobile phones. Now, that doesn't say that the framing is always wrong, but we do know that when the framing can be wrong, that it can lead to terrible consequences. So one of them is, in a very comic sense, from the medieval manuscript Facilius Medicinae, in which they tried to identify the organs of the body and as it corresponded with the zodiac. Now, that's not going to save anyone's life. It's not going to cure any diseases. That would be a misframing of trying to find a harmony of the heavens above and the body's organs within. Yet we constantly, as people, as humans, misframe situations by trying to impose our sense of how the world should work in one domain, cross-applying it to another and getting it wrong. And an example of that is Lysenkoism, right? Lysenko was a botanist, or I use that term lightly, I should say a scientist, in quotation marks, in the Soviet Union after the revolution, so around the 1910s and 1920s and the 1930s. And what he had done, Lysenko, is he had applied classical Marxist-Leninist ideology onto botany. And so he was the one who basically had theories of plant development and agriculture that corresponded to Marxist philosophy. For example, that you can plant different plants very close together, crops close together, because The theory being the Marxist theory was that that entities of the same class do not compete against each other for resources. Now, that probably isn't true for human beings. Marx was probably wrong about that. In fact, we kind of know that he is. But it's certainly untrue for plants. And Lysenkoism, of course, because it was adhering to Marxist ideology, was beloved by Stalin and others. And so he was actually feted and considered, he was known as the peasant scientist and was given great authority. And part of that authority was to set foreign policy for the young Soviet Union. And it led to famines, and tens of millions of people died of starvation, in large part because of terrible policies in pursuing his theories of botany. And for those people who had different views, who said, no, we should allow the science to determine what the science is, not Marxist ideology, Lysenko's vision was to identify them, to imprison them, or to shoot them and shoot their families. Now, that's very dramatic, and misframing doesn't always lead to a bullet, but sometimes it does, and we're going to get to that later. Okay, so when we're framing, what is it that we're doing? What does it actually mean, and how can we do it better? Well, there's three features to a frame. They are causality, counterfactuals, and constraints. Let me take a second to think a little bit deeper about each one of these. Causality is pretty basic. It is how the world works and thinking in terms of cause and effect. This is really important because it makes the world comprehensible and it makes the world predictable. Now, we're not always right about our causality. In fact, we're often wrong. We presume that we understand the causal mechanism of something when we're wrong. We don't have it right. I'll give you an example. We've heard from Hank just now that someone he knows has had a second vaccine, got his second vaccine, flies to Florida, and 5 days later, the guy's dead. Now, we think that the person is dead because of that second vaccine, but was it that? Was it the side effect of the vaccine, or was it something else? Maybe the person died of COVID because, as we know from a vaccine, that it takes about 2 weeks for you to develop the sufficient antibodies after you've been vaccinated. For all we know, the tragedy was that the person didn't get vaccinated 2 weeks before he flew. He might have had enough antibodies to fight off the virus had he done so. The point is simply that even if we have the causal mechanisms, and if we have the causal mechanism wrong, there's still a benefit to it. And the benefit here of thinking causally is that we see the world as an environment in which not only do we have predictability and understanding, but we also have agency and responsibility, right? Because there's a causal mechanism that operates underneath all that goes on, we can actually leave our mark in the world because we can understand that the world at least is predictable, even if we've got it wrong in terms of what those predictions are. Let me pass to counterfactuals. So counterfactuals are not what is, but what if? And we're constantly asking these questions as well. What if I propose to her? What if I buy Bitcoin at $100 and it's 2011? What if I cross the street now versus wait until the light turns green and don't jaywalk? We're constantly playing the game of life several ticks ahead. And these counterfactuals are important because we can change them as well, right? Nokia had one sense of the counterfactual of what people wanted in consumers, but didn't think about it more deeply, as opposed to Apple, which posed different questions. What if we were to charge not $100 for a phone or $30 for a phone, which Nokia was doing, but we go for $800 for a phone? What will that mean? What will that allow us to do? What sort of features would we be able to bring into it that people would find interesting, right? So that's counterfactuals. And then there's the constraints. That's essential as well. That the world is filled with a chaotic environment in which we can't let our imagination just run amok. It needs to be constrained. It needs to be bounded and limited in order to be useful. And so when we're applying a mental model, not only do we have the basic causal mechanism behind us, not only are we constantly thinking about what if we were to change one thing versus another, but we have these constraints that force us to make what we're thinking and applying it, our frames to, as relevant as possible. Now, what this means is that there's a revolution taking place in which this basic feature of cognition that we do all the time can transform into being a tool that we can actively and deliberately use to make better decisions. By framing the world better, we can improve our decisions and get better outcomes, and therefore we get a better society. And this is really important because it actually is an affront to the classical behavioral psychologists that are sort of running the show in decision theory right now, right? You open up, you can walk to a bookstore and you'll see a book by Daniel Kahneman, you'll see many, right, among others. And the key thing they're going to tell you is that human beings are really bad decision makers. Why? Well, because we have bias, right? We're filled with biases like, loss aversion, right? Where we make decisions differently based if we're going to win money versus lose money, right? Or recency bias, because something's just happened more frequently, then we're going to think one thing versus another. The second problem that we have is that there's noise, there's variability in our judgments. And the third one is this view that actually the more data to have, the better decisions we can make. The point of the book that we wrote is to say that although that's not wrong, these features are true, it's not the full story. And there's something that needs to be regarded with much more muscle because it's newer and because we've been ignoring it for too long. And that is the role of mental models, that good choices aren't simply about taking, these alternatives and choosing and doing better at choosing between option A and option B. Good choices is about coming up with different options altogether. It's about having option A, option B, option C, option D, and option E, and then making our choice. And if we increase the range of options and we have better and more useful options, we can reach better choices and therefore get better outcomes. Now, it also suggests that if we're always framing that this maxim for innovation, that we ought to be thinking outside the box, is actually a metaphor that's profoundly useless because we can never think outside the box. We're always in a box. We just have to be more deliberate about which box we're in. Let me give an example of what I mean by all of this by talking about two different pandemics, Ebola in 2015 and COVID. Okay. So in 2014, at the outset of the Ebola pandemic in West Africa, you had two different ideas of what was going to happen. You had the WHO that had some of the world's foremost experts and had their finger on the most recent data. And you had Médecins Sans Frontières, or if you will, Doctors Without Borders, who also had some of the world's most important experts and had their finger on the most important data. In fact, both organizations had the same data and their experts had all studied at the same place and knew each other, but they framed the situation differently. For the WHO, they looked at the number of cases and the rising case numbers. And they said, this looks very familiar to the situation that we've seen before. So they had, if you will, a historical frame in which it was a problem, but local measures was able to remedy it. Médecins Sans Frontières had a different view of this. Again, same numbers, but they looked at it and they said, but look at the dispersion of it. You have a lot of these cases all around borders, suggesting that in fact, although the numbers are low, but there's probably a lot more travel going on than you'd otherwise expect if it was in the interior of the countries, and using their spatial frame, not their historical frame, their spatial frame, they bet that there's probably a lot more cases than the data is picking up. So Médecins Sans Frontières suggested dramatic international measures to squelch Ebola right away. In the event, the WHO won the case, but Doctors Without Borders was correct. And after several weeks of inept activity by the WHO, places, the Obama administration, among others, just blew the whistle and said, this is ridiculous, right? And they adopted the Doctors Without Borders frame and took the most dramatic control measures you can possibly imagine. And of course, the reason why we're all here today suffering through COVID and not dead is because of the dramatic activities that the governments of the world, the Western governments, did under really competent leadership doing. Someone said bullshit. Why don't we handle that in the Q&A afterwards? Where Ebola could have become a terrible, terrible pandemic, but it was squelched because of those measures. But it does suggest that you can have the same data, but look at it differently, and therefore come up with different answers. Now that's going to be really important for AI, because if AI is being trained on data, you would think that if you have all the data, you're going to get the right answer. And that's going to be an incorrect assumption, because of what's important is the frame that you bring to the data will drive the outcome that you get. Now let's go to COVID, okay? At the outset of the crisis, a very similar situation took place with two different strategies. In New Zealand, they went for an elimination strategy. In the UK, they went for a mitigation strategy. New Zealand had only a handful of cases, but still shut down the country, right? Under 10 cases, and they shut down the country. And the reason why is because they had the frame that this was like SARS, an absolutely deadly pathogen that you need to squelch really early and really harshly. In the UK, their mental model was that this was a lot like the seasonal flu, in which you could let it burn through the economy and let it burn its way out. And just basic measures like hand washing would be sufficient. In June of 2020, New Zealand was declaring itself COVID-free when the UK had one of the largest death rates of any country in the world. Now, the situation has since changed, and of course, there's a lot of other countries that have suffered even more dramatically and more terribly than the UK. And of course, New Zealand and other countries who have avoided the first phase of COVID haven't done so well in the second phase is because maybe they've been too complacent and therefore didn't vaccinate the population. But the point is that at the outset, if you had your choice of living in London or living in Wellington, a lot of people would have gone for New Zealand. So what does this mean for AI? Well, there's these same features of causality, counterfactuals, and constraints apply to AI because, as Hank pointed out, artificial intelligence requires a human being in the background to do very basic things. Now, this shouldn't besmirch artificial intelligence. In fact, one of the interesting elements of the book is that we're not naysayers to AI by any means. If anything, as people who've written a book called Big Data before and done well by it, we embrace AI and we're very much pro AI. We're the great champions of artificial intelligence and all the techniques, but we understand its limitations. The very things that humans are good at in terms of applying a mental model, choosing and applying a mental model, causality, counterfactuals, constraints, are the three things that AI cannot do on its own and need human beings in it. Take AlphaZero and AlphaGo, in which it was able to actually crush the best human players on these board games. AlphaGo being an algorithm that was trained both on human matches and in self-play. AlphaZero being entirely based on self-play, including the rules of the game being on self-play. Now, it's extremely good, but when we try to divine the different strategies that we're learning from it, such as a preference for mobility over place, what we find is that those very terms are ones that are things that humans have imposed on it, that are human models, rather than are ones that the computer knows itself. So all throughout it, we needed human beings to determine certain elements of first setting it up, but secondly, extracting the lessons from AI so we can make it meaningful and useful. The machine doesn't know it on its own. Next, when it comes to counterfactuals, when humans were able to, when AI was able to beat some of the best players in Dota 2, which is a strategy game which requires advanced planning, it seemed like a real win for artificial intelligence. But if you read the technical papers, you learn that in fact, mental models had to be baked in to the AI system all throughout the training of it, and in lots of very basic ways. And this wasn't even hidden by OpenAI, the research firm in California that created it. It was very overt. They even called it a hyperparameter. So one hyperparameter was team spirit. Otherwise, all of the individual bots are entirely selfish and they play only for themselves. But the only way you can win in Dota 2 and also in many other strategy games is that you have to work together and combine your forces. And if you act only as independent units and silos, you actually can't win. So you needed to actually create this hyperparameter of team spirit or of collaboration in order to win. And that's exactly what the human being programmers did, so that the AI could butcher the human beings in the Dota 2 match and win. And then thirdly is Coconet. If you've heard about it or if you Google it, it's one of the Google Doodles and it comes from Google. What they found is that with just a few notes, by training it on Bach's chorales, that it could actually create beautiful melodies. And if you wanted to really get a sense of how AI can really aid artists, and it's going to be the future not of just of medicine and healthcare and fitness and finance and everything else, but also in the arts, just listen to it and you'll hear the most exquisite music. And of course, it's being created by an AI, but it's not really created by an AI because it was trained very deliberately on all of Bach's chorales. And so it's exuding the, if you will, the counterfactual, but more importantly, the constraints that Bach has put into it in the melodies that he created and the harmonies that he created. So this changes our view of AI. We're not just simply sort of blind to the world in which we can give lots of data, apply a deep learning algorithm, and then just sit back and watch artificial intelligence give all the answers that we wanted to improve the world. Far from it. People like Gary Marcus, a good New Yorker who you may know, who's at NYU and creates lots of companies, among others, have made a vigorous case for why artificial intelligence has baked into it very fundamental limitations that don't take away from the fact that AI is going to do transformative things throughout society and improve the state of mankind. I truly believe it will, but that we need to be conscious of what these limitations are and work within them. And the biggest limitation is that it can't apply a mental model, and more importantly, it can't change these mental models. It can't reframe when it needs to. So how do human beings do it? And how do we reframe when we need to? Well, there's 3 different ways we can do it. And it's through the repertoire, to repurpose a frame, and to reinvent one. The repertoire is pretty basic. We'll have lots of frames in our mind through our educational system and through experience. We develop a whole slew of frames, and we can choose one or choose another one. Another one is to repurpose it. If we come in contact with a frame from another domain, we can actually take it and transform it and use it for our purposes when we need to. And the third one is to invent a whole new frame when we need to. There's lots of instances in which, like Copernicus, the world sees the situation in one way, and we say, no, there's another way of looking at it, and we can look at it in this entirely new way as well. Now, that's actually quite infrequent. Usually when we use the vernacular of, I'm going to reframe this a little bit, what we're really doing is we're taking a frame from one domain and applying it to another. When these reframings happen, they are very memorable, they're very rare, and these are the people who we've heard of, like Einstein and Galileo and Elon Musk and Jennifer Doudna for CRISPR. But it's really useful because institutionally, we can actually we can help people and train them to become better framers and reframers. And one great way that that's done, and it's been done for 100 years, is through the case study method. If you think about the business school case study method, what it is doing is teaching students frames. It's basically saying you're confronted with a problem. They don't want to know at the outset what the answer is. The professors will get to that. That is ultimately the purpose of the case. But really what you're trying to do is identify the frame you need to use in order to make a good decision. And that is what the debate is around. And what's interesting, and in the book, we wrote a beautiful, well, I consider it a beautiful vignette about this, is that in the very first Harvard Business School case study, which was called the General Shoe Company, and was published in 1921, so yes, exactly 100 years ago from today, when they, on the single page at the very bottom, that what they ask of the students is not what should we do, but what are the features that you need to keep in mind in order to understand how to make a decision about this situation. In other words, it's basically telling people, how should you frame this? Right? So it's very interesting that back then, that was so critical to be done. I should also say that in our book, we then, after lauding the case study method as a pedagogical tool for framing and reframing, in a later chapter, we come back and stab it in the back because we see that there's a lot of very basic fundamental problems with the case study method as well, but I'll leave that aside for the moment. You also have these archetypes of people who can do great things and who can help organizations. And one archetype that we talk about in the book is the Cassandra, the person who sees the future, but who doesn't have a voice and needs a voice, needs to be empowered by the organization to speak truth. Right? The fall of Troy for Cassandra, but it could be the fall of Nokia in a commercial setting. But there's also the court jester, and there I had a lot of fun researching this and writing this. And I'm a guy who's got a score of books on medieval jesters on my bookshelf now because of it. And what I was really attracted to was this idea that people thought of the jester as the clown or the minstrel or the joker. And it was far from it, although some were just that, and usually they had a sharp tongue. That was a part of what they did. The reason they did is because the jester in medieval history was the one person at court who could speak truth to the king. Now, a smart jester would speak truth to the king in comic form, just like Jon Stewart tries to speak truth to Americans, in comic form, and did that very successfully among others who've done that. By doing so, the jester was trying to, help the sovereign frame and reframe situations better. And there's lots of great cases in which the jester was able to get the ruler to see things differently through the well-placed limerick or witticism at the right time. So what this points to is that institutionally and individually, we can become better at framing and at reframing. And that's going to be really important because the goal that we want through these mental models is not simply to settle on one and go forward all together in unison and globally cooperate in a single path in a single direction. The world is complex. There's a lot of multiple ways in which we can handle our challenges, and we're not handling our challenges particularly well. So the best thing we could aspire to is to have a diversity of frames, the widest number of frames as possible, and that these frames can clash together. Instead of trying to prevent conflict and confrontation, we should embrace it and welcome it and say, yeah, let's bring it in. Let's have a mosh pit of different frames that can come together, can commingle and intermingle, and can win and can lose. And as long as we are tolerant of multiple different frames, that should be a good thing for society, because if we all choose on just a single frame, we might have it wrong. I mean, we might think that the single frame is democracy. That might be good. But we also might think the single frame is Nazism, and that wouldn't be good. And although that sounds very, dramatic to bring up in this context, chapter 8 of our book begins and tells the story of Hannah Arendt being arrested by the Gestapo. And it goes from there, right? So it's to say that one of the features of the book was that we wanted one that spoke not just simply to business people to think about how they could think about frames and also about people in society, but also what it meant for political philosophy. And in effect, what we're doing is we're reinterpreting classical liberalism through the lens of cognitive science, and also pointing out the limitations of technology, because the world that we're going to be in tomorrow is one in which machines are going to make all the decisions. What is the role of humans? And the role of humans is going to be that we frame and that we reframe. We're going to need that constructive conflict, and we're going to need that tolerance so that we can have many frames together. And a nice depiction of how these two things can coexist is the wonderful statue not too far away from where you all are now in the financial district, in which we've got, Charging Bull, who's ready to gore, and we have, Fearless Girl, use of fearless is very appropriate, who's staring it down. And looking at this image, it is clear to all of us who is stronger. Where does this take us? It's that diversity is the first step, but not the final step of what we need. Tolerance is a step, but not the final step. It's about pluralism. It is about allowing these different ideas to exist. And what we need to resist most of all is this mental monoculture. This is going to become more important because in society right now, I think the clash that we have, the difficulty is no longer between left and right or open and closed. Really what it is, it's about the hyper-rationalists, those who see the world as one in which human beings are so fallible that we need to put our faith into AI and let machines make the decisions to overcome the problems that we face, versus the emotionalists, those who say, no, we just got to go with our guts, move aside the eggheads, let's just allow ourselves to do the right thing, because there's an authenticity in just deciding and just letting it all hang out. And we say that both camps are wrong. The AI camp get it wrong, the hyper-rationalists get it wrong, because we can't simply trust the machine, because the machine is not going to encompass the totality of the world. And when the world is always changing, there's no way for it to be flexible enough to change as well. If the situation, the underlying features of the world is going to be different one day to the next, we need to reframe how we see the world, and the machine can't do that as well as we can. At the same time, when it comes to the emotionalists, those people who just want to make decisions with their golden gut and believe that they can simply just push aside all this sort of examinations and reflections of every iota of an issue, that too is a failure, because although sometimes making instinctive, instant decisions actually does improve decision making, more commonly you get it wrong and it ignores lots of things. Right? Ultimately, what we are saying is that all that is without, all that is in the world today begins not because of something that's external to us, but is actually internal to us, the way that we see the world. And we don't see the world as it is, but as we are, right? Which is a sort of a rephrasing of a line in the Talmud, in which if we're going to make good decisions in society, we have to first think through the world that we're in better than we've been doing already. Let me stop there, and I want to thank you, and I look forward to your questions. And I will stop the screen sharing as well.
Okay, thank you, Ken.
I have a question. Is artificial intelligence the same as expert systems?
Good question. It is different. We could be here all night talking about it, but I'll explain the quick difference. Well, first, what is artificial intelligence? The term artificial intelligence is always different, right? Every decade, what AI means becomes something else, right? AI, when it was first coined by John McCartney and Marvin Minsky in 1956 for the Dartmouth Conference, was basically about hand-coded symbolic logic, right, through Lisp. Today, people are talking about AI, and what they mean is deep learning, which, although a little bit like the perceptrons of Rosenblatt, there is a linkage there, is really quite different, and it's really all about learning from data and purely from data, and in some ways trying to be as model blind as possible. So we should leave aside semantics, and of course it also anthropomorphizes the technology, which we don't want to do. But expert systems feels very embryonic. It also captures human beings' values, judgments, and decisions, and then in effect extrapolates. Whereas deep learning doesn't need, so it'll be biased with human biases, but the whole point of giving it to an algorithm to analyze patterns in gargantuan amounts of data is that it identifies things that we wouldn't have known to look for, because there was never, if you will, a theory for us to actually have the mental model to actually look for it in the first place. And there's a lot of, I could talk about some of the really fabulous research that's taken place in that area. I mean, the classic one in ophthalmology is they were looking for whether you could predict through retina scans. This is about 2019. Predict through retina scans if you can identify cardiac events, basically if someone's going to have heart disease or a heart attack, through the eye retina scan alone. Researchers found that they could identify within plus or minus 3 years to a 95% degree confidence, a little bit less than that, like 80% confidence, the person's age. They could identify to like a 70% confidence whether the person is a smoker. They could identify to basically a 98% degree accuracy if it was a male or female. Wait a minute. That was never known among eye scientists. If you ask any of them before the research, can you tell through the retina the gender of the person? They would have said no. There's no way to do that. They still don't know what the computer is looking at, what the algorithm sees to identify, again, with almost perfect accuracy, like 98% accuracy, if it's a male or female eye that they're looking at, but it's spotting something because it's getting it right. Right? So that's the lovely thing about deep learning. It's incredible problem. We don't have a theory for it. Is it really a science? How can we trust it if we don't have explainability? There's so much money getting poured into AIX, they call it, AI explainability. DARPA is pouring because regulators kind of feel like they want to know these things, and it forces us to confront ourselves and our limitations to know that there's this entity, AI, that will be able to know some body of knowledge better than we would know ourselves. Today, it happens to be on low stakes things like predicting the gender of someone's through their retina. But what if it's predicting the likelihood that they're going to have cancer or not 5 years before, or whether this particular drug is going to be effective? I mean, I'd be willing to roll the dice and trust the AI to think that it knows something, but regulators and others would not, right? It says perhaps more about me than about AI. So it's to say, it's a great question. Let me leave it there, but to say it's a great question, I think the two things are very separate. Dina, it looks like you're trying to talk, but you're on mute.
Somebody came in and gave another talk to this group from Google, and they said with driverless cars now, they're talking about if a driverless car is heading toward a cliff and it's going to fall off the cliff and kill the driver, or it has a choice of veering left and hitting 3 people, what is a driverless car supposed to do? And you know what I mean? So they're thinking about these things. I don't know the answer. I'm sure they don't know the answer either, but they are thinking about it.
It's brilliant. Yeah, and are you going to I mean, what do you do? And who's going to make the decision? So you need human beings for that as well.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, Ken. Ken, how exactly does framing get placed from the programmer to the AI?
It's embedded through all the decisions that get put into, it's a great question, all the decisions that get put into the model that one is creating, okay? Hence, you have a mental model, but you also have a statistical model, and then what you would do around it. So I'll give you how would a frame work. First, an example would be the choice of data that you use, right, would be how you are framing an issue, right? That you are choosing data from this particular data set. We often say that the algorithm isn't biased, but the data is biased, right? But that's actually not always true, right? Some algorithms are actually programmed that if they see an outlier, they throw it out, right? So by doing so, and this is sort of famous research examples in the last 10 years of algorithms that have done that, because it just makes the world simpler and you don't have to worry about these tail events that you don't care about anyway. But in medical science, what they found out was actually those tail events that all seemed like noise turned out to be rare cases that by throwing it out, you were no longer detecting. And you had to redo all of your analysis and then learn this whole new body of knowledge about rare events. And of course, as we've increased by orders of magnitude, the data that we throw into our algorithms, what looked like rare events actually turned out to be more common than we thought, right? So there, if you will, framing it was saying, we're looking for appealing to healthcare for the masses versus we're looking for orphan diseases, right? And those are two different statistical models, two different ways of looking at the world. One's not wrong versus right. If you are trying to get rid of, say, colds in school children, or if you're Walmart trying to identify, how to sell Pop-Tarts, right? You don't worry about the tail events. You don't care about people who buy caviar, right? But in the case of healthcare, what you really wanted was to identify these tail events. So you had to rethink your model as well. So it's through the choice of data, the choice of model, all the decisions that you're making, the hyperparameter that the OpenAI researchers had to make. They literally had to build in code to impose, if you will, a concept or an idea. What they were imposing was a mental model of how human Dota players won their games, and so that the machine could actually recreate that.
Gotcha. Now, how could mental models be used in our personal lives?
So it's really essential. All right. My co-author Victor tells a beautiful story about his mother who had hypertension, and they put her on a particular drug to bring down. So his mother at the time was about 88 years old, right? And so maybe actually in her 90s, so like say 92 years old. And so they find out that she's got high blood pressure. And so the doctor very innocently and rightly prescribes medication for her to bring down her high blood pressure. But by doing so, and that's the right thing to do, the right medical intervention. But by doing so, she became very lethargic, very depressed, and was sort of in the doldrums and wasn't going out. And Victor thought about it, and he's also Austrian, so this is happening in a Germanic environment where the doctor is always right, and they've got their practices, and so he thinks how he can sort of change the situation. And he goes to the doctor and he says, how about if we reframe this? She's apparently lived with high blood pressure all her life, so for her it's sort of normal. Why don't we let her keep her high blood pressure and take her off the medication? It's true that she will run a risk of having a stroke and dying, but she's in her 90s and she'll probably have a better life because she'll have more energy and she'll be able to do things for herself and she'll be happier for it. And the doctor said, yeah, this is interesting. Let's see what happens. So they took her off the medication. Her spirits lifted, her energy lifted. She saw her friends. She went out for walks every day. She saw her friends. And 4 years later, she dropped dead of a stroke. Okay. And everyone was happy. And they felt that the last part of her life was a very satisfying one. But it took a beautiful son and also a wise doctor to reframe medical practice, right? From one in which you treat the disease among the way that it's ought to be treated to prevent, a stroke versus allowing that sort of ailment, right, to exist and therefore improving quality of life before the stroke would take the person. And for someone in the 90s, that was the right thing to do. Now we can do that all the time. This idea of framing, I mean, the third co-author comes from a business school, right? And that's what he's teaching people. And although framing feels like it's different and new for you and I, who are sort of like civilians in life, like we do important things, but nothing like we don't command armies and don't sign billion-dollar checks. But people who do command armies and do sign billion-dollar checks are highly sort of aware of their mental state before they make decisions. And framing is the way that they do it. And that's the term that they use. So venture capitalists and the investment committees of venture capitalists literally talk and invoke this idea of how are we framing this issue? How about if we were to try to frame it differently, right? And in the sciences, framing is absolutely essential. When Linus Pauling saw the structure of the DNA in the helix form, right? And then wrote a very famous academic paper in the 1950s that was lauded and he was applauded, and so he's going to get a Nobel Prize for it when he uncovered the triple helix form of DNA. A couple months later, Watson and Crick said, no, it's a double helix, right? So the mental model was different, but the point is that this technique of framing, which has been a part of the sciences since Ptolemy and Copernicus, is now shifting into ordinary people, to human beings to do who are not scientists, but if you're a general or you're an investor. And the whole purpose of the book is that we want it to shift again to you and me and my school teacher and my kids, right? To sort of say, hey, we can all do this and come up with better options in the world, better alternatives. Why I'm so impassioned about it is you look at every problem that we face, the big ones like global warming, or should I get a vaccine, these or how should I vote? But particularly the ones that we've been kicking the can down the road for so long, like antimicrobial resistance or climate change. To me, it's mystifying why we can't tackle these issues and why we can't resolve them. And one of the reasons why I think is that we frame the problem wrong, and we have to do better at how we frame it to come up with better alternatives and therefore better answers and better solutions. Because if we just simply try to brute force it by one side saying you're wrong and the other person saying, no, I'm not, you're wrong, we're getting nowhere in the world, right? That's not going to solve our problems, but we've got to solve our problems. And what I do fear is the creeping authoritarianism, a new form of fascism, which is on the political sphere cropping up, and we see it in Russia and in Turkey and to a lesser extent in Hungary, right? And certainly in China. But in a very quotidian societal way, we're seeing that same sort of me, not you-ism, and if that will, that mental monoculture on American campuses and in American media called cancel culture, which is absolutely reprehensible. So we are militating in favor of this idea of classical pluralism, a term that we're no longer talking about. We don't even aspire to have as a virtue anymore. But this idea is that, that you can think one thing, I can think another thing, and I will I will accept the fact that you see these things differently, and I will honor and venerate your existence and your right, if you will, to see the world differently. If I claim that how you see the world is somehow illegitimate or wrong, I'm doing some sort of cosmological disservice to you as an entity in the world. But it has to be reciprocated, right? You have to also accept the fact that this is how I see the world. And now let's have a good faith conversation. Easier said than done. I think it's going to be really tricky. In fact, I sometimes get quite depressed. But we wrote a book hoping to inspire others and ourselves to how the world can move in a way that we think will be the right thing for the world.
Well, the trick, it seems, when we're talking about mental models, and I was researching this, preparing for your talk, because mental models, there's various types in psychology of mental models, which you deal with inside of your book. But the thing is, the thread that goes through that situation that Dina talked about with the car. Does it go off the cliff? Does it swerve into the group of people? Or the situation you talked about with the elderly person and the son stepping in with the doctor's recommendation. It all depends on what someone values. And the big topic shift to the macro topics of pandemics or global warming. When it comes to our leadership and what kind of decisions they make, it all depends on what you're valuing. Like in the case with the doctor and the son, the doctor valued the quality of life of his mother over the extension of her life. The doctor was valuing, okay, I can extend her life maybe another 10 years, but that would lessen her quality of life if they were to go through his recommendations. Dean was talking about driving off the cliff or veering into the three people. Now that's a tricky one, but it's the bias or the value of the human that's programming that AI, that's driving the car to, endeavor what the car is going to do. And right now, with the world, the way we're handling as human beings, this pandemic, we're not doing so well because of what different people value. You're talking about the me versus you. If people are just valuing themselves and what they call their freedom, we're not going to get through this. We all have to have a certain intrinsic or common value, like I would say we used to have, in order to get through these big major issues that, our lives depend on, and the next generation's lives depend on. What say you, Kenneth?
Absolutely. Viktor Frankl, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, said that, that the Statue of Liberty on America's East Coast should be matched by another statue on the West Coast in the Bay of San Francisco for the Statue of Responsibility. And you could only imagine how the debates over COVID might be different, and mask wearing and vaccinations had not only did we vaunt this value embodied in a statue, the Statue of Liberty, but also a statue and a value of responsibility and what that meant for, how the two things interact and how we need to actually, if you will, accept this other value in order to somehow be whole as a country. So these values are important, and these values in some ways can be considered as frames, right? Monarchy and monarchism is a frame. Democracy is another frame. Liberalism is a frame. And what's so interesting is that liberalism as in the 16th century, 17th century political philosophy of liberty, not in America, liberalism means left of center. The classical term was a liberal was a country, a polity that had rights, right? And those rights were guaranteed by the sovereign. Now, those rights were also, we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? That all men are created equal. These are rights that can't be taken away, right? That are required in order to have a government. Now, if you think about it, suddenly there's a tension between liberalism and democracy. These two things are not, they can be fused together. You can have liberal democracies, but you can have illiberal democracies. You can have liberalism in non-democracies, right? In democracies that are not liberal, right? If 51% of Americans vote to take everyone who's got blue eyes and push them over a cliff, well, that's democracy, right? What's wrong, right? Don't we believe in majority rule? Well, no, liberalism says no. You've got these basic rights that can't be taken away. In this case, in favor of minorities and against the tyranny of the majority. So values are both, they both generate frames. They're also the result of frames, and we can use them. And we're going to have these tensions as well. And how we resolve these tensions, hopefully through good faith. The problem that I see and sort of the snag in the vision is, well, what if you have one set of group of people that are operating in good faith and another who aren't? And if that's the case, then it's really hard to have any form of dialogue or any type of cooperation. Are we there in American society? Are we there in other societies? I think it's really hard to say. I think it's really hard to say because every person on one side sees the other as the enemy, and so it's not clear.
I have a question. Let's talk about Watson. Watson, the IBM, is that expert system, deep learning, or artificial intelligence? How would you classify Watson?
So first, it's hard to say, but Watson's really interesting because it is a grab bag of different techniques, but it's basically, I would say it's an expert system. First, let's dispense with AI because that's sort of a banner term. That's almost like a marketing term to basically mean computers that handle judgments that used to be only done by human beings. So Google, the Google search engine is an AI, self-driving car is an AI, spell check and translation is an AI, autocomplete is an AI, right? So we'll just allow it. So is it an expert system or is it deep learning? Well, we know for certain it's not deep learning, right? The deep learning has basic structural forms of statistical models and algorithms that are used in the network, and Watson doesn't do any of that. So Watson is if you will, a big probability table based on Wikipedia entries. That's a very unglamorous way of thinking about it, but that in effect is ultimately what it is. We know, for example, that in the case of Jeopardy, 97% of answers were titles of Wikipedia pages, right? So you get a sense that it was sort of an expert system. It was basically making an inference being trained on a lot of data, and it was highly tuned to do one thing, and that was win at Jeopardy. And when IBM tried to apply it to other uses, notably healthcare, it completely failed. And although I think it was definitely a worthwhile attempt, and so I'm very grateful for them to try it, I really want to reward them and praise them for it. At the same time, I'm very bothered that they allowed their marketing team to go full throttle on it and to make claims that were just patently false or just illegitimate. That they shouldn't have done. And if you think about how some of the great AI shops of the last decade have operated, they do something totally different. You never hear about Google pre-announcing what they're doing or how good they're doing things. They just do it, and then you see it, and then you're just amazed. As a small example, if anyone has had to use Google Translate lately, it's just stunning I mean, to me, it's unbelievable what it's doing. But also, even in English, when you're typing and you type in here, H-E-A-R, when you mean H-E-R-E, or better yet, I mean, that's a little bit obvious. I mean, it shouldn't be obvious, but it is. But sometimes it also chooses better words for you. Well, certainly for me, you know, I'm a writer, and you think, oh, that actually would be a better word. And so for all these reasons, I think that and DeepMind, again, DeepMind is probably maybe the best example of this. DeepMind didn't sort of trumpet their protein folding algorithm before it was announced. In fact, if anything, they were really stealthy about it and downplayed it until the announcement. They had one announcement about a year ago, and then another announcement about 2 months ago. And the announcement 2 months ago was breathtaking, right? I mean, I think that they're a potential candidate for winning a Nobel Prize based on the work that they've done now for protein folding. So I'm very sad about Watson and IBM, and of course IBM as a business isn't looking very good. So I think they've been distracted by some of these things.
I just wanted to add one more thing about Watson. I read on Slashdot, I believe, that that Watson, IBM tried to focus Watson on cancer treatments, and there were great hopes that it would find something that other human physicians and scientists did not see. But it turned out Watson did not find anything new after coming through all the data. So that was a disappointment. I would have thought, I think many people hoped that Watson, that strategy would have been, would have been fruitful with medical treatment.
That's true. Although keep in mind, just basic machine learning techniques has actually identified new predictors of cancer, right? So, but these are right now small findings, not big findings. Like you don't throw a spotlight onto AI spotlight onto this thing called cancer and then solve it, right? First, there's no such thing as cancer. There's like 1,000 different cancers, right? And secondly, you don't solve it. You just simply can either identify it earlier or can treat it better, right? There's these small things, but these small wins, the classic paper from about 2011 or 2012 by Daphne Kohler and Andrew, last slide, but if you look at Kohler, she's the last author, so therefore the most important in it. And then Andrew Beck at Harvard and Daphne Kohler is at Stanford. They applied a machine learning algorithm to, it was a beautiful study. They took biopsies, the cancer cell biopsies of breast cancer patients, and tried to predict if they can identify which biopsies were severe cancer patients. And they did that by not giving it any instructions of what to look for whatsoever, but simply gave the patient's survival rates, right? So this patient lived for another 25 years, this one died in 6 months, right? And so on and so on and so on. And they did it for hundreds of thousands of patients, right? But it was not millions, interestingly, it's still hundreds of thousands. And the algorithm was first they wanted to identify, could the algorithm function and predict severe cancer as well as a human pathologist? And the answer was yes, it could. But then they asked, well, what is it looking for? And it identified 11 telltale signs of severe cancer. The problem, or the nub, was that the medical literature only knew of 7 of them. 4 of the items that they identified as being able to be predictors of severe cancer were things that were not part of the medical literature, that human pathologists didn't know to look for, but the AI could tease out. So it's a little bit like the other study with the retinas, right? And then, of course, the AI does this and doesn't know why it's done. It's in effect a black box. You need a human being who has mental models, who creates representations and abstractions to look and try to tease out, well, what are the commonalities? And then say, hey, I think it's this. I think it's finding this. And so what the human being did is they looked at it and they said, one of the features that it's looking at is not simply the cancer cells, but the distance of the cancer cells from each other within the cellular material known as stroma, right? We don't even have a single word for that. Like that's a really ungangly thing to say, right? But that, if you will, but then, 150 years ago, trying to understand what a proton, an electron, and a neutron were, and trying to create a diagram of it was an ungangly thing to say. And now we have a mental map of the structure of the atom. So it's ungangly, or it's gangly rather, but that's what the world is until we simplify it with a mental model or a term that we can use to represent what it is we're trying to understand. So AI is already doing these great things, but they need human beings behind it to interpret it, to make sense of it so that we can actually apply it and use it.
And how about religion? People will read the Bible and take out of it what they want to take out of it. Like, people will see AI information and take out of it or interpret it as they want to interpret it.
I think it's so. AI and religion is, I was going to write a book on AI and religion. It is such an interesting topic to me. My ideas are just at the outset of thinking about it. But the way that you phrase the question, as soon as someone invokes religion, that's the sort of cell signal to know, don't go there, don't touch it. We can only get into trouble. But I think there's a lot of interesting, does AI force us to rethink religion in a new way? And I think the answer is yes. Now, my ideas are really poorly formed, but let's go back to the importance of the geocentric versus heliocentric theory of the world. What that did is it really knocked humanity off its pedestal because it identified that, in fact, the Earth was not the center of the cosmos, but in fact, was just a simple planet like all the other planets, right? And someday we might be able to find another life form, right? That is non-human and non-terrestrial, non-earthling. And we might say, well, if human beings are no longer the sort of chosen one of God and this one singular entity in the whole cosmos, but it's just one of, like the bar in Tatooine, right? One of a myriad of life forms that within the cosmos that are advanced, that can communicate, that can build rocket ships and smoke cigars, at midnight listening to John Coltrane. And so then what will it mean for religion, right? What does that mean if with heliocentrism, we're just one of many planets? What if we're just one of multiple life forms? What does it mean for God? And if we can't understand things, but AI can, so all that is to be knowable doesn't fit into our 3 pounds of fatty tissue within our skulls, but we have to leave to faith to the AI because we can't understand it, but its answers are still correct. Well, suddenly, I think it has first deep implications for epistemology, for human beings and what is knowable in the world, and for our role in the world, but also has deep implications for that which is outside of human beings and above us and beyond us, what we might consider mystical or holy and sacred. And I look forward to hearing from other people what, over the next decade, as others are thinking about this, the answers that they come up with. I didn't write a book on AI and religion because it wasn't ripe enough in my own mind, but I am deeply interested in it.
Ken, what are the best mental models for business? For someone going into a business venture?
It's not. So for in some instances, there's some books and some people who see mental models as ones where you can identify it and give it a name and sort of sort of trade one, apply it, and then take something else.
You want to eat?
We didn't do that in our book. We simply talked about mental models as conceptually rather than looked at different particular ones. There is a person named Shane Parrish who writes a blog and has a website called Farnham Street, F-A-R-N-A-M Street. And he's very good, and he looks at mental models, will sort of identify things like second order effects, right? Or as sort of a conceptual tool that you can use. And those things are good, and I think he does very good work. But I'd be hard pressed to say which one is like the best one. I think the best thing to say is that find one that works at the right time, right? And know that there are models and that you can change them. That's going to be the critical thing, because if not, if you feel like there's a hierarchy and there's one in particular you should use, I mean, buy low, sell high, it gets pretty quickly into territory of just hucksterism and superficialities. So I'd be cautious to try to identify just one, for example, or several.
Okay. You said Shane Parrish?
Shane Parrish of Farnham Street is his blog. And Farnham Street comes from the name of the street in Oklahoma where Warren Buffett has his Berkshire Hathaway headquarters. And Warren Buffett, of course, is the famous investor.
Right.
Thank you very much, everyone. This was really incredible. I'm really pleased that I had a chance to sort of talk about the book and sort of interact with everyone.
So Kenneth, what's your next book going to be so you can come back again?
What's that? Say that again.
What's your next book going to be so you can come back again for the next book?
I'm thinking about it. Do I build on this one? Do I do something totally different? I don't know yet, but I will let you know. Dina will know, and I'd be really happy to come back.
Thanks, Ken. That was great.
Yes, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Great. It's late, and I'm afraid I'm going to wake up the family. So if you don't mind, I think I'm going to beg away. But I want to appreciate all the time and all the great questions. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.
AI says thank you.
Well done. Thanks. You need a robotic voice. Good. Take care. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Sweet dreams.
Bye-bye. Yeah, thanks. Take care.
Sweet dreams, right.